All right, then, econ friends, welcome back to our final video, a real quick one here on economic growth theory. So up until now, if we trace our progression, we started off with some basic definitions, and we introduced real simple graphs and a couple of formulas to understand how to measure and track economic growth. We then went into a bit more deeper discussion of the factors that can influence it. And in our last video, we brought back in some of those models from earlier, the Solow model, for example, and we kind of enhanced it to show the impact that technology and institutions can have as productivity boosters, right? By shifting that production function upward. So we know what economic growth is. We know why it's important. We know the ingredients that can contribute to it, with some of those caveats, of course, and we know how the institutions and technologies can really enhance it. In this last video, I just want to give a quick jump from pure economic theory into policy theory. What we want to really talk about here is this. Given the importance of economic growth, given that we understand how critical it is, and given that we understand the factors that can influence it, economists oftentimes ask the question and debate heavily around this. What are the policy options that we can have to promote growth and promote development and promote innovation? In other words, what role can a government play in fostering the conditions that can bring economic growth and sustain prosperity to its country? Okay, so here we're taking all that knowledge that we learned in the last couple of lectures, and we're going to ask a couple of questions, namely, given all this, what's the role of government? What kinds of policy options do countries have to push for and achieve and sustain economic growth? Now, one thing that we need to bear in mind is this. Countries are at different places in their pathways. So because low-income countries are really concerned about catching up, just trying to get out of poverty and kind of get more toward the middle income or the rich world, while rich countries, which are already there, are more concerned with sustaining economic growth in the face of diminishing returns. Because rich countries and poor countries are at different places and face different incentives and have different needs, economists will typically advocate for different policy prescriptions for each type of group. Let's break those down. First, by analyzing policies that might be helpful for developing countries. And the policies that might be helpful for developing countries include, among others, number one, developing a market economy. Tied to that, engaging in more foreign trade. Lots of poor countries tend to be overly protectionist. They're insular. But if countries want to achieve some catch-up effect, they have to engage in more foreign trade. Oftentimes, poor countries will begin, and if you take a look at the history of lots of today's rich countries, back when they were poor, they typically started off with very labor-intensive, low-value manufacturing. But over time, as the country got a bit richer, as their people become, as they gain more human capital, as they can afford more physical capital, those countries will oftentimes evolve from labor-intensive, low-value manufacturing to labor-intensive, high-value manufacturing to then more capital-intensive and even service-focused industries. Okay, so there can be like a progression, not totally predictable, but a somewhat predictable progression of how countries can take this path. But it's all going to revolve around, will this country engage in more foreign trade? Because you're going to need richer countries to purchase your products in order to kind of launch, okay? Tied to this, a third policy, encourage more investment in physical capital. We know that physical capital is very important, especially for poor countries that are early in their production function. So they're going to get lots and lots of bang for the buck on capital investment. But these poor countries are poor. And there's a conundrum. If you're poor because you don't have capital, but you're poor, how do you have money to get the capital to not be poor? Oftentimes, this requires poor countries to engage in what is known as foreign direct investment. Refers to situations where the ownership of business activities in a poor country, they're actually owned by firms that are based in other, typically richer countries, okay? Foreign direct investment has pros and cons, but it can bring a lot of needed human capital and innovation capital to poor countries, okay? So engage in more physical capital investment, either through foreign direct investment or failing that, simply through direct foreign aid, which refers to just a direct transfer of money or food or other resources from richer countries to poorer ones. What else can poor countries do? They can provide property rights to align the incentives of the population with the incentives of firms, with the incentives that drive economic growth. These countries can actively work to reduce corruption, to increase transparency, to shift from those extractive institutions to the inclusive ones. And finally, and again, there's a bit of a chicken and egg issue here because they're poor and they don't have a lot of resource, but if they can gain, whether through direct foreign aid, through loans or whatever, if countries can gain access to resources, they would consider improving their productivity with targeted investments in healthcare, in education, and in infrastructure, in those underlying ingredients that can help the entire population be more productive, okay? So those are some options that the poor world has. Of course, easier said than done, okay? On the other hand, if you think about it, richer countries, right? So we're going to call this one 2. So number 1 was our poor countries. For higher income countries, for richer countries, you have to remember that typically these countries have already implemented all of these policies that we identified for poor countries. I mean, rich countries already typically have market economies with robust foreign trade, lots of investment, defined property rights, etc. That's why they're rich. They've already done that difficult work and built those institutions and capabilities. So for rich countries, their primary constraint is not going to be, at the catch-up level. It's going to be at the sustain level, because rich countries are likely to be constrained by diminishing returns. And therefore, they're going to have a lot of pressure to innovate, to develop the ideas that are going to boost a production function. So given that, what are some of the policies that the rich world should engage in? And again, rich world is already wealthy. They're not tied to catch up. They're looking at sustainability. They're not looking to develop the basics like the poor countries. They're looking to innovate, to keep their edges, to keep their advantages, to boost their production function. What policies can help achieve that? Well, there's a couple. We believe that rich countries can subsidize research and development, subsidize the processes that lead to more ideas, to more innovations. This can be done through universities, through private firms, through government agencies. There's lots of ways, but we believe that one way that the rich world can pass policies to keep their edge is to pass policies, pass laws, provide resources to subsidize R&D. Rich countries need to work aggressively to defend intellectual property and patent rights. We learned earlier that the catch-up effect means that some poor countries have the incentive to steal, to illegally acquire intellectual property rights. Well, this is going to cause a major incentive issue in the rich world. So rich world governments really need to defend intellectual property rights. And a third thing that rich nations can do policy-wise is to think about creative, clever policies that will allow productive workers to come together. Okay, we have this idea in growth theory. It's known as the advantages of agglomeration. Nice high tuition word for you there, my friends. The advantages of agglomeration. What this refers to is the fact that, at least in some industries, productivity goes up when workers in that industry, even workers in different firms, but when workers within one industry can easily interact with others in the same industry, again, even at different firms, even competitors, but that when people within that industry are around others in that industry, there's going to be some gains in productivity. This helps explain in part why, for example, tech is concentrated in Silicon Valley and in certain parts of the East Coast by MIT and North Carolina, around universities actually, right? Silicon Valley emerged as a hub for technology because it was a place where everybody in tech can come together. We call that the advantage of agglomeration. We see finance markets in New York, entertainment markets here in Los Angeles. We see lots of different geographical areas where certain industries are just centered and rooted. That's based in part on the advantages of agglomeration. So given that, rich world governments can try to pass innovative, clever policies to bring these workers together. They can do it in part by making it easier for existing workers to relocate within the country. So if you're a recent college graduate and you want to go into tech, can we make it easier for you to somehow get rooted in one of those major tech centers in our country? And another way to bring productive workers together could be by having really thoughtful immigration laws that bring highly skilled immigrants into the country. If you can bring highly skilled immigrants into the country and combine that with ways to make it easier for existing workers, or as you guys will soon be, recent college graduates, to relocate to those great clusters and those centers where industry thrives, we can help increase productivity. And that, my friends, wraps up this lecture series on economic growth. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.